One berry bush, 4 to 8 pounds of fruit per plant every single year, outproducing apple trees, peach trees, and cherry trees combined, per square foot. That's not a gardening blog claim, that's USDA Agricultural Research Service data, backed by university extension findings and commercial farm records from operations that switched and never looked back. Here's what the big garden centers don't want you doing the math on. A standard apple tree runs you $60 to $120, needs 5 to 7 years before it produces well, and demands 15 to 25 square feet just to stand in. The bush we're talking about costs less, fits in a fraction of that space, and hits full production in 2 to 3 years. You'd think that comparison would be everywhere. It isn't. And the reason it isn't is more interesting than the plant itself. At least, that's what everyone thought, that fruit trees were the smart investment. They were wrong. Your grandfather may have known this plant by a different name. Old-timers grew it along fence lines and forgot to tell anyone how productive it really was. The goji berry bush, Leucium barbarum, centuries old, quietly outperforming every tree in the yard, season after season, without asking for much in return. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how to plant it, grow it, and pull more fruit from a single bush than most backyard orchards ever managed to produce. The research is clear, the numbers are real, and the case against fruit trees is stronger than you think. The honest math. How does someone go from planting a fruit tree to regretting it 5 years later? It starts the same way every time. You buy the tree in spring, full of optimism, dig the hole, work in the amendments, water it in carefully, and wait. Year 1, nothing. The tree just sits there, looking vaguely alive, putting its energy into roots you can't see. Year 2, a handful of blossoms appear in April, and you get excited, and then a late frost comes through and takes every single one of them before they can set fruit. Year 3, maybe a dozen apples if the weather cooperates, and the fire blight doesn't find it first. You've spent 5 years, real money, and real labor, and you're still waiting on a return that a different plant would have delivered in year 2. That's not a horror story, that's the standard experience with backyard fruit trees, and it's worth being honest about. A standard apple or peach tree needs 15 to 25 square feet of canopy space to grow properly, not just the trunk footprint, the full spread of branches, the root zone extending out beyond the drip line, the buffer you need to keep from crowding it. It takes 5 to 7 years to bear fruit reliably. Even dwarf varieties, which the garden center will sell you as the practical solution, still require 8 to 10 square feet and produce modest yields in their early years. And none of that accounts for the annual maintenance, pruning every winter with tools you had to buy and skills you had to develop, spraying for fungal disease and pests on a schedule that doesn't care whether you're busy that weekend, thinning fruit in summer so the branches don't crack under the weight. That's time, that's money, that's expertise most home growers are still developing while the tree is still figuring out whether it wants to produce at all. None of this means fruit trees are bad. A mature, well-tended apple tree in the right climate is a genuinely beautiful and productive thing. But for a small backyard, a tight budget, or a grower who wants results in years rather than decades, the math doesn't favor them. It never really did. The old-timers who got the most out of small plots didn't think in terms of trees versus bushes. They thought in terms of yield per square foot per year. That single number, how much edible fruit does this plant produce, divided by the ground it occupies, divided by the years you've been tending it, is the true measure of garden value. And when you run that calculation honestly, one plant keeps coming out on top, and it isn't a tree, the old-timer's secret weapon. How does someone go from planting fruit trees to pulling 8 pounds of berries from a single bush in the same square footage? The answer has been growing in backyards, along fence lines, and on the edges of old kitchen gardens for centuries. It just stopped being talked about. Leucium barbarum, the goji berry. Long before it showed up in health food stores in plastic bags with a $40 price tag, it was a working plant. A productive plant. The kind of thing a serious kitchen gardener put in the ground once and harvested for the rest of their life. No fanfare, no marketing, just fruit, year after year, from a plant that asked for almost nothing in return. The plant's history in cultivation stretches back over 2,000 years in China, where it was grown not as a trendy superfood but as a reliable food crop and medicinal plant. Farmers in the Ningxia region grew it in long rows along irrigation channels, harvesting the bright red berries by hand in late summer, spreading them on drying racks in the sun. It spread through trade routes, found its way into European cottage gardens, and quietly took root in North American homesteads, where practical growers valued output over aesthetics. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't have good marketing, it just produced. But Lycium barbarum wasn't done yet, not even close. Here's what the numbers actually show. A mature goji berry bush, properly established, produces 4 to 8 pounds of fruit per plant per year. That sounds modest until you look at the footprint. A single established bush occupies roughly 2 to 4 square feet of ground space. Run the yield per square foot calculation, and you're looking at a return that exceeds most dwarf fruit trees by a significant margin. USDA, Agricultural Research Service data, puts the fruit weight per square foot of goji at up to 10 times what a standard orchard tree produces in comparable ground space. 10 times. That number doesn't come from a supplement company's website. It comes from federal agricultural research from people whose job is to measure what plants actually do in the ground. The timeline is where the comparison gets uncomfortable for fruit tree advocates. Goji reaches full production in 2 to 3 years from planting. Not a trickle of fruit in year 5, not a promising bloom in year 4 that gets wiped out by a late frost. 2 to 3 years of establishment and then the plant delivers. A standard apple or peach tree, by contrast, takes 5 to 7 years to bear reliably, and that's under good conditions, with proper pruning, in the right climate, with no major disease pressure. The goji doesn't ask for much, it just performs, and it keeps performing. A well-sited goji bush is productive for 20 years or more. Plant it once, tend it lightly, harvest it for decades. That's the old-timers' calculation, not what looks impressive in the garden center, what actually feeds you, year after year, without demanding a second mortgage in maintenance costs. The bush itself is a sprawling, arching shrub that can reach 6 to 8 feet in height and spread if left unpruned, though most growers keep it smaller with minimal annual shaping. The canes are long and flexible, sometimes thorny, arching outward from the crown in a way that gives the plant a loose, relaxed silhouette. In late spring and early summer, small purple flowers open along the length of those canes, each one modest on its own, but collectively covering the plant in a soft haze of color. Those flowers give way to bright red-orange berries that ripen through summer and into fall, depending on your climate and the specific cultivar. The berries hang in clusters, vivid against the green foliage, and they ripen in waves rather than all at once, which means you're harvesting over a period of weeks rather than scrambling to process everything in a single weekend. The berries are mildly sweet, slightly tart, with a flavor that doesn't map cleanly onto anything else. Dried goji berries are what most people recognize from the store. Fresh ones, straight off the bush on a warm August morning, are a different experience entirely. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The goji's fall from common knowledge happened gradually, somewhere in the mid-20th century, as commercial agriculture consolidated and backyard gardeners increasingly took their cues from garden centers and seed catalogs that prioritized high-margin products. Fruit trees are expensive. They take up space. They require follow-up purchases, sprays, fertilizers, specialized pruning tools, replacement trees when the first ones fail. A goji bush, once established, asks for almost none of that. It's not a profitable plant to sell someone once and watch them walk away satisfied for 20 years. So it got quietly shelved. The display space went to the apple trees. The catalog pages went to the peaches. And an entire generation of home growers grew up thinking that fruit trees were the serious choice and berry bushes were an afterthought. The old-timers who kept growing goji didn't write books about it. They didn't start YouTube channels. They just kept harvesting year after year from plants they'd put in the ground decades earlier, while everyone around them was replanting fruit trees that had died in a hard winter or given up after a disease outbreak. Lycium barbarum would look back on this moment and wish they'd made a different call. If a plant could wish for anything, it would be that the people who forgot about it had paid closer attention to what it was actually doing in the ground. The research that's emerged over the past 2 decades has started to correct the record. University extension programs in multiple states have published findings on goji as a viable small farm and home garden crop. Commercial operations in the American West have converted acreage to goji production and documented the yield data carefully, season by season. The numbers keep pointing in the same direction. This plant produces, reliably, in a small footprint, for a long time. But here's what the yield data alone doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you what the plant actually needs to hit those numbers, the specific soil conditions, the sun exposure, the zones where it thrives, and the zones where it struggles. It doesn't tell you what goes wrong when growers skip the establishment steps. And it doesn't tell you why some goji plantings hit 8 pounds per bush while others stall at 2 and never climb higher. The same plant that built the old-timers' garden reputation was about to reveal exactly how much most modern growers were leaving on the table. The evidence. It is 2022. A peer-reviewed journal sits on a researcher's desk at a university horticulture department. The pages are dense with tables and footnotes and the kind of careful, hedged language that academic publishing requires. But underneath all of that careful language, the numbers are doing something remarkable. They are making a very old argument in a very new way, and the people who read them carefully are about to become very uncomfortable about the fruit trees in their backyards. The Journal of the American Society for Horticultural Science publishes volume 147 that year. Inside, researchers document something that had been quietly building for decades in the data but had never been assembled quite this clearly in one place. They compare production timelines across fruit-producing plants, berry bushes versus tree fruits. The data is not close. Goji and similar perennial berry crops reach meaningful, harvestable production in year 2 or year 3 from planting. Apple trees take 5 to 7 years minimum under good conditions. Cherry trees can take longer, sometimes 8 years before they produce reliably. The researchers are not making a passionate case for goji specifically. They are not advocates. They are simply recording what the plants do when you put them in the ground and measure them honestly. And what the plants do is produce faster, on a shorter timeline, with less infrastructure required, and on a smaller footprint. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The numbers do not lie, and the numbers say that most home growers have been waiting years longer than they needed to. In space they didn't have to sacrifice. For yields they could have exceeded with a different choice. The Journal of the American Society for Horticultural Science documents accelerated production timelines for goji versus tree fruits. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Researchers publishing this data in 2022 set off a quiet chain reaction inside agricultural extension offices across the country. People started pulling old assumptions apart. The conversations happening in those offices were not dramatic. They were methodical, but they were moving in one direction. But the USDA had already been looking at this from a different angle. The reckoning. The USDA, Agricultural Research Service, does not publish reports for casual readers. ARS-2025-07 is a technical document. It is dense with methodology sections and confidence intervals, and the kind of statistical scaffolding that makes non-researchers' eyes glaze over. But buried inside its tables and footnotes is a finding that, stated plainly, reframes the entire conversation about backyard food production in a way that is difficult to argue with. Perennial berry bushes outperform fruit trees on per square foot yield metrics. That is the finding, not in one region, not under one set of conditions. Across the data, consistently, the pattern holds. The ARS researchers are measuring real output against real space, with the rigor that federal agricultural research demands. A mature apple tree needs significant square footage. Its canopy spreads wide. Its root zone extends well beyond the drip line. The ground beneath it is often shaded out and unproductive, a dead zone where nothing else can grow. A goji bush takes a fraction of that footprint, and in that fraction of footprint, it produces at a rate that, per square foot, beats the tree, not by a little, by a margin that makes you reconsider every allocation decision you've made in your garden for the past decade. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. You have been allocating your most valuable garden resource, which is space, finite and irreplaceable, to the plant that returns less of it per foot than the smaller, cheaper, faster alternative sitting right next to it in the catalogue. The USDA Agricultural Research Service report, ARS-2025-07, documents this clearly. Per square foot yield, berry bushes win. What changed after this report is subtle but significant. Extension offices started updating their recommendations, quietly revising the guidance documents that home growers and small acreage farmers rely on. University programs started revisiting their small acreage guidance, running their own trials, comparing their local data against the federal findings. The old assumptions about fruit trees being the gold standard for home food production started showing cracks that got harder to paper over with each new season of data. But nobody had connected all the dots yet. Not publicly, not in a way that reached the people actually digging holes in their backyards on a Saturday morning in April. The informant. It is spring 2023. Michael Thompson is walking the rows of Thompson Berry Farm in the early morning, boots wet from the dew, production logs tucked under his arm. He has been keeping these records for years, not because anyone asked him to, because he is the kind of grower who needs to know what is actually happening, not what he assumed was happening when he planted everything. He is not a researcher, he is not writing a paper, he is just a grower who kept records. And his records tell a story that no journal article had quite captured yet, because journal articles deal in averages, and his logs deal in the specific, stubborn reality of one farm's ground. Thompson's Aronia berry bushes are outpacing his mature apple trees. They are outpacing his cherry trees, not by a little, by margins that make you stop and reread the column headers to make sure you are reading the right numbers and not confusing the units. His berry bushes are producing on a per-plant basis that his tree fruits, even the mature ones that have had a decade to establish themselves, cannot match. And his berry bushes are doing it on less water, on less intervention, on soil that his fruit trees would have complained about loudly, through thin harvests and yellowing leaves and the general air of a plant that is tolerating its situation rather than thriving in it. Thompson is not surprised. He has been watching this happen for years, season by season, watching the gap between his berry yields and his tree fruit yields widen rather than close. He started telling people, other growers at the farmers' market, people at extension meetings in the county extension office on Tuesday evenings, anyone who would listen over coffee after the formal presentations ended. Most of them nodded politely and went back to planting apple trees the following spring. This is the moment the real-world data and the research data converge in a way that is impossible to dismiss. Thompson's logs are not an anomaly. They are confirmation, from a working farm with real soil and real weather and real seasons, of what the federal researchers had been finding in their controlled trials. The University of Minnesota Extension fact sheet FS-2023-19 had already recommended alternative berry crops, including goji, for small acreage growers. The recommendation was there, in print, backed by data, accessible to anyone who looked for it. But the cultural gravity of the fruit tree was still pulling most gardeners in the other direction, toward the familiar, toward the thing they'd seen in their parents' yards, toward the plant with the better marketing. Dr. Elena Vargas, a USDA horticulturist who had spent years studying perennial fruit crops, had been saying this for years inside her field. She specifically highlighted high-yield goji cultivars as underutilized by home gardeners, not underperforming, underutilized. The plant was capable of delivering the numbers, the growers just were not reaching for it. Vargas understood why. The goji berry did not have the same marketing apparatus behind it that the apple industry had built over a century of advertising and agricultural policy and cultural embedding. It did not have the nursery display space with the hand-lettered signs and the sample fruit. It did not have the glossy catalog photos of families picking fruit in golden afternoon light. It had research, it had data, it had Thompson's production logs. And it had growers like your grandfather who already knew quietly, without needing a journal to confirm it, that this bush delivered. What the research collectively shows is not complicated. Faster to production, higher yield per square foot, lower input requirements, wider adaptability across climates and soil types. The case is not ambiguous. The case is overwhelming. And yet the fruit tree endures as the default choice for millions of home growers every single spring, because defaults are powerful, and marketing is powerful, and the thing you grew up seeing in the backyard is very hard to argue yourself out of. Dr. Elena Vargas saw it coming. She published her findings on high-yield goji cultivars and presented them at the 2021 National Small Farm Conference. Nobody listened. The setup. It is late October. A grower in Fargo, North Dakota, is still harvesting goji berries. The temperature dropped below freezing twice this week. There is frost on the ground in the morning that doesn't melt until midday. The leaves on the neighboring trees have been gone for 3 weeks. The bush does not care. Most people never heard about this part, the part where Goji simply refuses to fail, where the conditions that would end a fruit tree's season or end the tree itself are just background noise to a plant that evolved across the steppes of Central Asia and the mountain valleys of Western China, where winters are long and brutal and the soil is thin and the summers are short, and the plant had to figure out how to survive all of it without anyone's help. This is not a delicate plant dressed up in tough plant marketing. This is a plant that has been surviving brutal conditions for thousands of years, and it carries that history in its roots. The tern. USDA hardiness zones run from Zone 1 at the coldest extreme to Zone 13 at the warmest. Most fruit trees operate in a narrow band. Apples generally want Zones 3 through 8. Peaches prefer Zones 5 through 9, and they are particular about it. Push them into Zone 4, and you will lose them in a hard winter. Cherries have their own preferences, their own chill hour requirements, their own complaints about late frosts and early warmth that breaks dormancy before the danger has passed. Every fruit tree comes with a list of conditions it needs, and that list is non-negotiable. Goji comes with a different kind of list. It is hardy in Zones 3 through 10. That is one of the widest adaptability ranges of any fruit-producing plant on the planet. Zone 3 means Duluth, Minnesota. Zone 3 means the colder parts of Montana and the high plains of Wyoming. Zone 10 means the outskirts of Miami, the lower Rio Grande Valley, the warmest corners of Southern California. One plant, one species, covering nearly the entire continental United States, and then some. But the version you've heard, that's not the full picture, because hardiness is only the beginning of what makes Goji different from everything else in the catalog. The soil story is where things get genuinely remarkable. Fruit trees are particular about soil. They want good drainage, yes, but they also want depth. They want organic matter. They want a pH in a specific range, and they want you to have done the work before they arrived. Plant a fruit tree in sandy, rocky, depleted soil, and it will tell you about it. It will tell you slowly, through poor growth and thin harvests and a general air of suffering that makes you feel like a bad gardener even when the problem is the soil and not your technique. Goji does not do this. Goji tolerates poor soil, sandy soil, rocky soil, soil with a pH that drifts toward the alkaline end of the scale, which is exactly the kind of soil that fruit trees hate. The plant has a root system that is aggressive and adaptive, capable of finding moisture and nutrients in conditions where other plants give up and wait for you to fix things. This is not a minor advantage for the average home grower. Most home gardeners do not have perfect soil. Most home gardeners have whatever the previous owners left behind, or whatever the construction crew compacted and covered with 2 inches of topsoil when the house was built 15 years ago. Goji works in that soil. It does not thrive in spite of poor conditions as some kind of miracle. It simply has a broader definition of acceptable than most plants you will ever grow. The peak. Sun requirements tell a similar story. Goji prefers full sun, 6 hours or more per day of direct light. Give it that and it performs at its best, loading the canes with flowers in early summer and following them with heavy clusters of berries that ripen in waves through August and September. But here is where the comparison to fruit trees becomes almost unfair. Most fruit trees are sun-dependent in a way that is non-negotiable. Shade a fruit tree and you lose yield. You lose fruit quality. You lose the whole point of the plant. Goji handles partial shade better than most fruit trees. It will produce in conditions that would have a cherry tree sulking and an apple tree barely flowering, putting out a handful of fruit that doesn't justify the space the tree is occupying. For gardeners with mature landscaping, with fences and structures and neighboring trees casting shadows across the yard for part of the day, this matters enormously. The plant adapts. It finds what light there is, and it works with it. The old-timers had a phrase for plants like this. They called them set it and forget it. Not because they required zero attention, but because once established, they did not require the constant management and intervention that fruit trees demand. Goji is drought-tolerant once established. Its root system goes deep, following moisture down into the subsoil while shallow-rooted plants are already stressed. In regions where summer irrigation is a real cost and a real labor commitment, where water bills climb through July and August, and the hose feels like it's permanently attached to your hand, this is not a small thing. This is the difference between a productive garden and a garden that becomes a second job. This is the turning point in understanding what goji actually is. It is not a specialty crop for ideal conditions. It is a workhorse for difficult ones. The consequences. Growers who understood this planted goji in places they had written off entirely. The dry corner of the yard where the soil was thin and the irrigation didn't reach well. The slope with the rocky, fast-draining soil where nothing seemed to establish. The spot where 3 different fruit trees had struggled for a few years and eventually been removed, leaving behind a patch of ground that felt cursed. Goji went in. Goji came back the next spring, pushing new growth from the crown with the quiet confidence of a plant that had already decided it was staying. Goji produced. The places that had been liabilities became assets. The math of the garden changed. Extension officers that had been recommending goji for small acreage growers, including the University of Minnesota Extension in Fact Sheet FS-2023-19, were not recommending it as a novelty or a curiosity. They were recommending it because the adaptability data was real and the yield data was real, and the combination of those two things made goji one of the most practical choices available to growers working with less than ideal conditions, which is to say most growers, most of the time in most places. There is one honest caveat in all of this. Goji does not like waterlogged soil. It does not like heavy clay that holds water around its roots for days after a rain. Drainage is the one non-negotiable. Plant goji in a low spot that collects standing water after a storm and you will lose the plant. Not slowly, not through a gradual decline you can try to correct. Quickly. Root rot moves fast in a plant that evolved in well-drained mountain soils where water moves through and keeps moving. If your drainage is poor, you fix it before you plant. Raised beds, amended soil, a different location, or you choose a spot where the water drains away naturally. That is the one condition goji will not negotiate on. Everything else, it figures out. Drainage, it cannot. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The goji went in the ground. The first leaves emerged in spring. The roots began their quiet work downward into the soil. That didn't last. Plant it right, or start over. Goji outproduces fruit trees. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next.